Happy Mother's Day, everybody. Just in case anybody is not aware, we do not have potluck this Sunday. We are changing into deference to Mother's Day. It will be next week, so everybody can go home and celebrate Mother's Day. And without further ado, we are a little tight on time today, so we are going to get right into the sermon material, which is a continuation of the series that we're doing on biblical sexuality. Now, in contemplating where this series is going to go, I really want to do a lot more than just talk about what rules the Bible has for sexuality. You can all read the Bible for yourselves and see what it says. Do not fornicate, do not commit adultery, do not commit homosexuality, and do not even allow for the lusts of those things to live in your heart. But I think what the far more interesting question is why God made those rules about sexuality in the first place, which is especially what I want to focus on today. Now, of course, when we talk about these things, it should be enough for us to hear, "Thus saith the Lord," and do those things. But I'm human, and I want to know why those rules exist. And even more than that, the fact is I'm a lot more likely to obey those rules if I understand some of the purposes of why. Obeying the sexual guidelines in the Bible is really difficult. I think it's one of the most difficult things that we have in scriptures to follow. And today I want to focus on ways that the Bible has taught me a little bit about why these rules actually exist. There's a really deep well of material on this, specifically because God says explicitly, multiple places in the Bible, that human sexuality is actually meant to be a reflection of how he relates to humanity as a whole. We visited a little bit of that in the book of Ephesians last week, and he talks about it a lot in the Old Testament as well. And so I don't really have a set outline going forward from here of everything I want to talk about in this series. The context of the Bible about this is so great and so undercovered that I'm a little overwhelmed with which direction exactly to go with it. But for today, I want to continue on this idea that we talked about last week, that God repeatedly in the Bible says that his relationship towards mankind, and especially his relationship between Jesus and the church, is like a marriage. And by extension, human sexuality is a reflection back on God's character and behavior. Today I want to talk about two specific aspects of how human sexuality teaches us about the nature of God. And those two aspects we're going to talk about today are intimacy and commitment. Regarding the first, intimacy, this is one of the first things that God's relationship with man really teaches us about. It teaches us about intimacy. The definition of intimacy is complicated enough. It's used to mean enough different things that Merriam-Webster actually gives seven separate definitions of the word intimate. One is marked by close association, contact, or familiarity, and another is of a very personal or private nature. But the seventh definition that's listed in the dictionary is my favorite, and it says that the word intimate means belonging to or characterizing one's deepest nature. Some people have also quipped that the meaning of the word intimacy can be found in the word itself, into me see, if that helps you to think about it. But intimacy is also a central characteristic of God. It's something that God desires. And I think it can be argued that one of the reasons that God created humanity in the first place may have been for intimacy. That's not the only reason, of course. He says that he created man to glorify himself. But the idea here is that God relates to other beings, and he wants to share himself with them. God deeply wants to know his creation, and in turn, God wants his creation to understand his deepest nature in return. Consider just a couple of verses on this, such as John 17, verse 3, where Jesus is praying and says, "And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Or Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, where God says, "Let him who boasts, boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord." And God just comes out and says this. He wants to be understood by you. He wants to be intimate with you. And because he is God, he already knows you intimately. He knows all of the best and worst parts of you. And this is really the kind of intimacy that you want. He knows the best and worst parts of you already, and he still loves you, probably in spite of it. Now, I want to read you Psalm 139. Psalm 139 is written by David, and here David is really speaking of how God loves him. But the entire psalm is really an ode to intimacy. Mostly the ways that God knows David more intimately than any human being can know David, but in a few places also the ways which David returns that and wishes to know God intimately as well. I'm going to read here from verses 1 through 18. O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for the darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame is not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sands. I awake, and I am still with you. And I think that this psalm reveals that God has that deep desire for intimacy, both ways. He wants to deeply know us, and he wants to be deeply known by us. And of course, the point of this is that the intimacy that God wants is a direct parallel to the intimacy that romantic couples want. In fact, this connection is so close between intimacy and romance that we actually use the word intimacy as another word for sex. In a similar sort of way, the Bible has a particular euphemism for sex. It says to know. For example, in Genesis 4:1, the ESV translates this phrase literally, and it says, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." And there's good reason for the close ties between these words. There are multiple ways to be intimate with another person. There are multiple ways to be vulnerably close with another person. But they are all wrapped up and epitomized, most especially in romantic relationships. I want to show you a diagram that's been helpful to me in thinking about the different kinds of intimacy. This has been devised by a Church of Christ preacher named Joe Wilkie, and he calls it the intimacy pyramid. The idea here is that these are different types of intimacy that really should be built upon one another. As you go from the lower tiers to the higher tiers, the amount of people that you can have that type of intimacy with becomes less and less. For example, at the very bottom, you have the intimacy of values. This is the type of intimacy you can have with the most amounts of people. All it means is that you can relate to somebody else because they share similar values to you. In fact, here in our congregation, this is a type of intimacy that we share universally with each other. We all are here for the same reasons. We all share the same values. We're here because we want to learn about God and please God and play a role in building his kingdom. That fact that we have an intimacy of value with one another here is the reason that I can talk today about a controversial topic and you're not all throwing stones at me. And I don't have this conversation with people outside the church because we're not going for the same thing. We're not trying to achieve the same objectives, and that limits the sort of conversations that you can even have with those other people. And of course, this type of intimacy is foundational for romantic intimacy as well. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers." And the idea is that it's just not practical to be married to somebody who's working towards completely different goals and values than you are. In a practical sense, that just makes it impossible for you to be on the same page all the time for many things throughout your marriage. But above that, we have emotional intimacy. This is the intimacy of not only being able to talk about emotions, but actually sharing emotional experiences with one another. For a lot of people, and I think especially for women, emotional intimacy is one of the most potent types of intimacy, and it can feel very close to romantic intimacy as well. But do you know that the Bible actually commands for us to strive for emotional intimacy with one another as the church? Romans 12:15, for example, says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." That's talking about emotional intimacy. It's the sharing together of an emotional experience. We're supposed to have that with other people, but we can't have it with just anybody. In fact, it can be dangerous to have emotional intimacy with people who certainly don't share your values, and furthermore, who might weaponize your emotions against you. That happens all the time. And that takes us to the next tier, which is intellectual intimacy. Intellectual intimacy means the sharing of minds. And it's generally only possible to be intellectually intimate with someone that you already have shared values with and the respect of being able to share emotions with. And this is the type of intimacy of deep friendships. A friend, really, in my mind, is somebody I can share the depths of my mind with. Somebody who has the capability of understanding what I'm thinking. And of course, intellectual intimacy is something that you want with a spouse as well. For someone like me, it's more powerful even than emotional intimacy. If you want to empathize with my feelings, that's nice and all, but if you can be of one mind with me, if I can share complicated and abstract thoughts with you and you understand me and honor me in my way of thinking and you dialogue with me about it, that's something that's actually kind of rare and special. I can't have that with very many people. And I suspect that all three of these things taken together builds the kind of intimacy that we see really profoundly with the relationship of David and Jonathan in the Old Testament. I'm not going to cover this story very deeply, but I'll read to you this from 1 Samuel 18:1 through 4, which says, "After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt." Now, of course, David and Jonathan did not have a sexual relationship, but they had all of these other types of intimacy. For the rest of their time together, they were united in purpose, they shared each other's emotional experiences, and they knew each other's minds. You see this so clearly, for example, in Jonathan's defense of David before his father Saul, and in their very emotional parting where they weep together in the field because David has to escape. The scriptures even say that they were one in spirit, and I think that's because they shared all of these things with each other. But of course, the last and smallest stage on the pyramid is sexual intimacy. And this is at the top of the pyramid because this is something we're really only supposed to share with one person. But it's also at the top of the pyramid because it works best when you have established those other types of intimacy first. Really, you should marry somebody if you have shared values with them, if you can share your emotional experiences with them, and if you can talk openly and share your mind with them safely. And if you have those three types of intimacy in their fullness, what happens is it really becomes natural to carry those things to the last level of intimacy, which is sexual. And that's what marriage is intended for. Those other types of intimacy actually support and build the substance of sexual intimacy as well. Now, if you ask me why I married Sarah, why I was desirous of her in a way that I have never desired anybody else, the ultimate reasons are not so much because of how physically attracted I am to her, although that's an important factor. The thing that separates Sarah from the women that I did not choose are really these three things: that I can share all of my values with her, that I can and want to share my emotional experiences with her, and that I can understand how she thinks quite naturally, and I can likewise express my deepest thoughts to her and feel understood. Those things taken together are really the building blocks of good sexual intimacy. And those of you who have been married a lot longer than I have can help me out with this. For example, men, if you don't talk to your wives all day, does she want to be sexually intimate with you at the end of the day? I think the answer is probably not. You can shake or nod your head if you're willing to participate with me. Women, if you shame your husband on something that he's done wrong and he feels disrespected, does he want to be sexually intimate with you? No. Those lower tiers are missing that build the greater total intimacy. And if the two of you have some sort of totally foundational disagreement on something, not a disagreement about the best course of action or the best way of doing something, but something really serious where you don't even want the same thing, where, for example, one of you wants to have children and the other one never does, where one of you wants to leave the church, or where one of you wants to completely disassociate from the in-laws, do you really feel like being intimate with them in those moments of stark disagreements? That's an issue as well, and that's the breaking of intimacy of values. Because in that moment, the most basic foundation of intimacy just isn't there. And this idea doesn't just apply to functional marriages as well. It applies to sexual dysfunction as well. One of the reasons that sexual temptation is so strong is because innately all human beings have a need for some sort of intimacy. And a lot of times I think sex becomes a shortcut to feeling that intense intimacy with another person. I can tell you that when I struggled with pornography in the past, what I discovered was that I was vulnerable to that because I was in a place in life where I was devoid of any sort of true intimacy with other people. I just didn't have any deep personal relationships at the time that I could really share those emotional, intellectual experiences with. And that made me hungry for any sort of modicum of intimacy that I could take instead. When I started putting effort into establishing really deep, intimate relationships with friends, that temptation lost a lot of its power over me, and I was able to control my own desires. But I think that concept also shows a great silver lining for people who are celibate. Just because you don't have sexual intimacy doesn't mean that you have to be left unfulfilled with regards to intimacy at all. These other types of intimacy are for you. And that probably sounds really trite to somebody who is struggling with being celibate, and it certainly sounded that way to me as well. But it's something that really worked for me, building these other types of intimacy first and seeing how I could build a functional life off of that. And I think it does reflect a God-designed structure of intimacy that we see between the lines throughout the Bible. I don't think it's a stretch to say either that that worked for the Apostle Paul. Remember what we read in Philippians chapter 3 last week. Philippians 3 verses 7 through 8 says, "But whatever gain I had, I counted it as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ." And if you pay attention to that, the thing that Paul says has made all of his own suffering and loss in life worth it is knowing Christ. He doesn't even cite his salvation there or his purpose in ministry. Paul says he is fulfilled simply because he knows Christ. He's talking about the special intimacy that he has with Jesus. To Paul, that means more than the loss of all the other things that he could have had, whether that's marriage and family, or the peaceful life that he otherwise might have had he not gone on mission for Christ. Now, let's move on to the next thing. Here's the second thing that God's behavior towards his people teaches us about sexual intimacy in the Bible. Throughout the Bible, whether you're in the Old Testament or the New Testament, or even really back in the patriarchal age, God always relates to his people through covenants. In other words, through a legal contract. God made his covenant through Moses, which allowed the people of Israel to become intimate with God. He made the new covenant through Jesus, which made all faithful persons to be a part of God's family. And even before these, he made covenants with Noah and with Abraham, and later with David, to commit his promise to these people. In all of these covenants, God places some sort of boundary and guidelines as to how we, as fallen human beings, may approach him. Jesus even compares coming to God as to coming through a narrow gate, as in Matthew 7:13 through 14, where he says famously, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow is the road which leads to life, and only a few find it." And God has placed similar sorts of boundaries and guidelines on sexual relationships by extension. Just as God holds himself to legal agreements, he holds his people to legal agreements through religious covenants. He holds man and wife to legal agreements as well, because their relationship is reflecting God's relationship to humanity in a parallel fashion. So what specifically are we supposed to learn from how God makes his covenants? One of the biggest ones is the idea of unconditional love through commitments. God's covenants say that man shall have no other God. Man shall remain faithful to the commandments which God has established, no exceptions. And in return, God says back to man, such as in Deuteronomy 7:9, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." And in Deuteronomy 31:8, likewise, "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." When you hear the Lord say that to his people, isn't that exactly the same thing that you want in a marriage? You want somebody who will be faithful to you. You want somebody who will never leave you nor forsake you. That level of commitment that God gives to us is to be reflected in marriage. And because we reflect God in our sexual behavior, he also requires of us, just like him, that we never leave nor forsake the one that we marry. Now, you may notice, even in Deuteronomy 7:9, which I just read, there actually is a condition to God's faithfulness. God says he is faithful to keep covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. In other words, God will be eternally faithful to us forever, without exception, unless we break faithfulness with him. He's not going to get tired of us. He's not going to stop loving us. He's not going to change his mind on his commitment and go love somebody else instead of us. God promises that that's something that will never happen. But if we choose to leave him, if we are unfaithful and abandon him and choose something else instead of God, then we do have the power to break that covenant which God has made to us, and God will cease keeping his covenant with us. And because marriage reflects God in this way, he gives us that exact same exemption in our marriages. It is the only one given. In Matthew 19:9, Jesus says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The reason that adultery is the reason given for a person to divorce their spouse is because it's the only reason that God ever took to divorce his people. God makes this explicit in many places. One such place is Jeremiah 3, 6 through 9, where he uses the picture of divorce explicitly. Here we read, "The Lord said to me in the days of King Josiah, have you seen what she did, that faithless one, Israel? How she went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and there played the whore. And I thought, after she has done all of this, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. She saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the lands, committing adultery with stone and tree." So God makes this allegory, this connection, explicit. In the days before Jeremiah, the people of Israel, the northern lands, they abandoned God altogether. They institutionalized foreign religions and ceased to worship Yahweh. And this is what God terms adultery in his relationship. It is allegorized by a person who abandons their spouse and trades them for sexual intimacy with another person. And God is consistent. He doesn't ask anything of us which he has not been willing to do himself. And so when Jesus delivers God's laws for marriage, when Jesus delivers God's law for marriage, it's consistent with how God has conducted himself in his marriage. We are to choose one partner, and we are to remain faithful to them till death do us part. Even today, we say that in our marriage vows, with God as our witness. But if our spouse breaks that covenant, if they engage sexually with another person, then God does not require us to hold to a greater degree of faithfulness than he did himself. We are then permitted to abandon that covenant that our spouse already broke. And this leads to a very interesting theological question, however, both for God's covenant with the people and with marriage covenants as well. Because God declares multiple times throughout the Old Testament that he has divorced Israel. He does this in Jeremiah 3, he does this with Judah specifically in Zechariah 11, and he declared from the beginning of the covenant that this would happen if Israel was unfaithful in the ending chapters of Deuteronomy when he gives the law. But we can ask the question, did God fully divorce Israel? Did he actually completely cut off his people? The allegory starts to break down a little bit here, but I think that there is something to glean out of this. Because even after God declares his divorce to Israel in Jeremiah chapter 3, and even after he breaks his covenants of favor with Judah in Zechariah 11, even after he abandons his temple, as he foretold to Solomon, that temple which was the conduit of intimacy and connection with his people, he still speaks to them. He still gives promises. This is really what the book of Ezekiel is about. But the point of it is this: even though Israel was unfaithful, and even though God had the right to divorce her, God still left the door open for reconciliation. And this, in many ways, shows that, many individuals were still able to come out of Israel after that and were saved in accordance with the salvation that was offered through Jesus. For this reason, I think it's appropriate to import that same idea into the idea of marriage as well. Jesus said that we can divorce a spouse over adultery. He did not say that we are required to. And I think that this is a godly thing, when possible, that our unconditional love for our spouse goes so far as to even forgive adultery. That's often just not possible, and God doesn't demand it of us. But I do think that God at least leaves the door open for it. Because the idea of marriage at the end of the day is about God's unconditional love, the kind of love that is only sourced in him. People are often cynical to the idea of institutionalizing marriage. You'll hear things like, I don't need a piece of paper to prove my commitments or to prove my love. And if the sentiment there is that the state has nothing to do with our marriages, I can sympathize with that. But the piece of the piece of paper is not the idea of marriage at all. The point of marriage is that there is a commitment made. Two people say to each other in front of witnesses that they will hold their vow and be faithful to them through all difficulty and conflict and suffering, even until death. It is a godly sort of commitment because that is the type of commitment that God makes to us. And there's a reason for doing it that way. I don't think that there can really be any complete form of love without that type of commitment. The reason that unconditional love is the highest form of love is because it is unconditional. Unconditional love says to another person, I will be with you always, no matter what. I will not leave when the going gets tough. It's the same love that Jesus gave to us upon his ascension, saying, Lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. And love without commitment is always going to be something different. Uncommitted love says, I am with you, but only until something better comes along, or until it becomes inconvenient with me. Imagine if those were Jesus' parting words to us upon his ascension. Now, the Bible tells us that we are not to bind those Christian sexual ethics upon those who are not God's people. 1 Corinthians 5:9 says that explicitly, and that makes sense. They don't know Christ, so how can they reflect him in their sexual relationships? But the following verses say that those same sexual ethics are of paramount importance to those who claim to be of Christ. To be a Christian means to be a little Christ. Those who bear his name must also take up his cross, or they take his name in vain. God has made our sexuality one of the principal ways that we show ourselves to be of Christ. In a sense, it's really a form of evangelism. Even in a sexually promiscuous culture today, society still honors and respects a man who has been eternally faithful to his wife. It's one of the most clear and unambiguous forms and expressions of Christ-like love, unconditional love, which we are actually able to make and keep. And I think a Christian marriage which is good is probably one of the most obvious teachers of Christian love, where each spouse can share all of themselves, knowing that the other person will not abandon them. When I was dating, there was a constant fear in the back of my head, and I think most people are like this. It's the fear that this person will not stick by me when they figure out who I really am, when they learn everything about me. And outside of marriage, even often inside marriage, people never truly reveal who they are to another living soul for this very reason. The idea of committed Christian marriage is that it is the only vessel wherein true intimacy is fully possible, because the other person has said, I will stick with you no matter what. Most people will never truly reveal themselves without that level of commitment, because if they do, there is always the risk that the other person will abandon them, and it forces you to reveal yourself as well. I don't need to reveal the deepest secrets of my heart to every single one of you. I can hide those parts of myself from you forever, but I can't hide them from my wife. We have a lifetime ahead of us together, and nor would I want to. Your spouse is the one person in the world who knows you so well that they become one with you. One of the best things about becoming engaged and getting married has been seeing the grace and acceptance that Sarah has had of my failures. She honored the responsibility that has come with fully knowing me as a person, and she's accepted me for who I am. When I fail, she still loves me. She loves me even when I don't deserve her love. And in that, I get to see just a little glimpse of how Jesus actually loves me. A Christian marriage which is bad is a teacher as well. And it's not the kind of teacher that I would wish for any one of you. But if we've made our vows before God, those vows still bind us whether our marriage is blissful or not. A Christian spouse trapped in a bad marriage still has the choice to show God's unconditional love. And I don't say that lightly. I've watched abusive marriages, And I know that abusive marriage is worse than almost anything else you can experience in life. But I also know that that's exactly the same kind of marriage that Jesus came to earth to consummate. He knew that in coming to earth, some people would choose him, and he knew that other people would abuse the gifts that he brought and use them to take advantage of others, to weaponize the church against others. And they would return his unconditional love ultimately by nailing him to a cross and leaving him to die in pain. That's the choice that Jesus made. That's the vow that we make too in marriage. We made this vow first when we were baptized into the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And we declared that we wanted to be like him. If we're married, this is the vow that we make to our spouse. We made the vow that we would be faithful unto death, no matter what may come. And that is a terrifying thing to vow to another human being. We can be sure that God will be faithful to his vows, but we have no such certainty with any human being that we might marry. And those of you who are young really need to watch and study good marriages. You need to see what a godly marriage can look like at its best, as a vessel for unconditional love that's just difficult to experience any other way. But you also need to study bad marriages. You need to understand the seriousness and risk of what you are vowing to when you attach yourself to another person. But whether you marry well or marry badly or marry not at all of us have the exact same choice to make. Will we use our sexual life to glorify God? People have the idea that their sexual life should be something private, but it just never seems to work out that way. No matter what a person's beliefs are, our choices about sexuality bear out consequences in our lives that just cannot be hidden. How you conduct yourself sexually in life will be one of the factors of how those around you see the face of Christ in you. And in the process, you're going to learn more and teach more about the nature of the love of Christ than nearly any other aspect of your life will. And whatever your story is, what I want most for you is to see the purposes of God in it. In the next life, if we've proven ourselves faithful to Christ, all of the mistakes that we've made will pass away. There will be no heaven in marriage besides our collective marriage with the Lord. Everything that went astray in our life is going to be made right. But in the here and now, our sexual lives do matter. They will impact how we perceive God. They will impact how others perceive Christ in us. And much of the happiness and suffering that we experience in life is going to hinge on the sexual choices that we made. The message is yours today as we stand and sing.